The wind had a name for every wire on the fence, and Silas knew them all. He knew the low hum of the top strand that spoke of a coming norther, the tight, angry shriek of the middle one when the summer heat had drawn all the slack from it, and the loose, mournful rattle of the bottom wire where the post had gone soft in the earth, a sound that meant work. He was mending that post now, his hands moving with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who had done the same task 1,000 times before, his knuckles scarred maps of past mistakes and corrections. The sun was a hammer in the vast, empty sky, beating down on the cracked earth and the brittle grass and the silent man, and the only sound was the scrape of his shovel against stone, the sigh of the wind, and the patient creak of leather from his worn tool belt. He worked until the shadow of the lone mesquite tree stretched long and thin, like a finger pointing east, toward the town he tried to forget existed. And only then did he straighten up, his back protesting with a dull ache that was as familiar as his own name. He had enough salt pork to last another week, maybe, and the coffee was down to dust, which meant the forgetting had to end. A trip to town was a debt to be paid for the privilege of solitude, and the interest was always too high. He would spend the rest of the day checking the line, walking the perimeter of the world he had built for himself, a world of silence and dust and the steady, predictable rhythm of the seasons. It was a small world, but it was his. He did not have to speak to the fence posts, and they did not have to answer. That night, the moon was a sliver of bone in a black sky. Silas sat on his porch, the day's heat still radiating from the wooden planks, and cleaned his rifle not because it was dirty, but because the repetitive motion of oil and cloth was a comfort, a way to smooth out the jagged edges of the day. The thought of town was a burr under a saddle blanket, a constant, irritating pressure. It wasn't the distance, nor the effort. It was the people. It was the way they looked at him, their eyes full of a quiet, pitying curiosity that was worse than open scorn, the way their conversations would dip to a murmur when he entered the general store, a silence that felt louder than their chatter. They knew his story, or the parts of it they'd cobbled together from rumor and whispers, the story of the wife who couldn't bear the silence and the child the silence had taken. They thought his isolation was a wound. They were wrong. It was the scar tissue, thick and hard and protective. He finished with the rifle, its blued steel cool and solid in his hands, and set it carefully back in its rack by the door. He would go in the morning. He would get what he needed and be back before the sun was high. He would not speak to anyone more than was necessary. He would not look anyone in the eye. He would be a ghost, a shadow passing through, and then he would return to his kingdom of dust and wire, where the only judgments were those of the land itself, which were honest and final and had nothing to do with a man's past. The land only cared what a man could do. It was a fair bargain. Morning. The sun rose, painting the horizon in shades of rust and pale gold. Silas hitched his horse, a steady bay gelding that had the same quiet, enduring nature as its owner, to the buckboard. The wheels groaned in protest as he loaded the few empty crates, the sound unnaturally loud in the pre-dawn stillness. The air was cool, carrying the scent of dust and creosote, a clean, sharp smell that would be replaced by the stale odors of sweat, cheap whiskey, and coal smoke the closer he got to town. He moved without hurry, his actions precise. He checked the harness, tested the axles, filled his canteen from the well, the rope whispering against the stone as he drew the bucket up. Each task was a small ritual, a fortification against the world beyond his fence line. He did not like leaving. The ranch was a living thing, and it felt vulnerable without him. The chickens susceptible to hawks, the well pump prone to whimsy, the silence itself liable to be broken by some unforeseen trouble. He swung up onto the buckboard seat, the worn leather familiar beneath him, and took up the reins. "Hup," he said, the single word, a small disruption of the quiet. The horse leaned into the harness, and the buckboard lurched forward, its wheels beginning the slow, grinding complaint that would be the only soundtrack to his journey. The sun climbed higher, and the world resolved itself into stark contrasts of light and shadow. Behind him, the small, solid shape of his cabin grew smaller, a bastion of order in a vast, untamed landscape. Ahead, there was nothing but the long, empty road and the town of Redemption, a place that had never lived up to its name. He kept his eyes on the horizon. He did not look back. The town smelled the same as it always did. He tied the gelding to the hitching rail in front of the mercantile, the horse sighing and dropping its head as if it, too, felt the oppressive weight of the place. The main street was a wide ribbon of churned dust, flanked by false-fronted buildings that slumped in the heat, their paint peeling like sunburnt skin. A few men loitered on the boardwalk in front of the saloon, their faces shadowed by the brims of their hats. their gazes lingering on him for a moment before sliding away. They were part of the town's landscape, as permanent and unmoving as the buildings themselves. Silas ignored them, his focus narrowed to the task at hand. Flour, coffee, salt, cartridges, a new whetstone. He ran the list through his mind, a litany to keep other thoughts at bay. Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with the smells of leather and dried apples and kerosene. Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor, a man whose body seemed to be made entirely of soft, rounded edges, nodded at him from behind the counter. "Silas," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "Been a while." Silas just gave a short, sharp nod in return, not trusting his own voice. He moved through the cluttered aisles, gathering his supplies with an efficiency that discouraged conversation. He could feel Abernathy's eyes on him, could feel the unspoken questions hanging in the air. He piled his goods on the counter, the canvas sacks landing with soft thuds. Abernathy tallied the cost, his pencil scratching against the paper. It was in that small, quiet moment, the space between the scratching of the pencil and the exchange of coin, that the doors swung open, letting in a rectangle of blinding sunlight and a silence that was different from the one Silas cultivated. It was a heavy, watchful silence. Two figures were framed in the doorway. A man, young and desperate, his eyes darting around the room like trapped birds, and a woman standing just behind him, almost in his shadow. She was still, so terribly still. She did not look like she belonged to the dust and the heat. Her dress was worn but clean, the fabric faded to the color of a washed-out sky, and her hair was the color of dark honey, pulled back from a face that was pale and composed, though Silas could see the fine tremor in her hands where she clutched a small battered satchel. Her brother, for that is what he had to be, had the same color hair, but on him it looked unkempt, a frantic mess that matched the panic in his eyes. He pulled her forward, his grip on her arm too tight, and made his way toward the back of the store, toward the small, curtained-off office where Finch conducted his business. Finch wasn't a banker, not officially, but he held more notes than the bank did, and his terms were stricter. Finch dealt in things other than money. Silas saw the way the townspeople in the store, the two women by the bolt of calico, the old farmer haggling over seed, went suddenly still, their eyes fixed on the floor, on the ceiling, on anything but the young man and the woman he was pulling along like a prize mare to auction. Their silence was a verdict. It was an acceptance of what was about to happen. Abernathy cleared his throat, the sound loud in the tense quiet, and finished his tally. "That'll be $4.60, he said, his voice strained. Silas placed the coins on the counter, his movements stiff. He should have left. He should have taken his supplies and walked out the door, and driven his buckboard back to the clean, honest silence of his ranch. He should have forgotten the look on the woman's face, the quiet, contained terror that was so much more profound than her brother's frantic fear, but he didn't. He found himself standing there, his canvas sacks at his feet, listening. The curtain to Finch's office was pulled back. Finch stood there, a man whose tailored vest and polished boots seemed an affront to the dust that coated everything else in town. He was smiling, a thin, precise expression that never reached his eyes. His gaze swept over the young man, Leo, with disinterest, and then settled on the woman, Alara. It was a look of appraisal, the way a man might look at a horse, checking its teeth and its legs. "Leo," Finch said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "You're late, and you're short," Leo stammered, his words tumbling over each other. "I know, Mr. Finch, I know, but I've brought you something better. Collateral. My sister, Alara." He pushed her forward slightly. She stumbled but caught her balance, her chin lifting just a fraction. She did not look at Finch. She stared at a point on the far wall, her stillness her only armor. Finch circled her slowly, his smile widening. "She's a bit thin," he commented, as if discussing livestock. "But she looks strong enough. What can she do?" "Anything," Leo said, his voice thick with a desperate eagerness. "She can cook, clean, sew. She's a hard worker, Mr. Finch, worth more than what I owe you. A year of service, too, to clear the debt." The men from the saloon had drifted in, drawn by the scent of a transaction, their faces impassive masks. They stood by the door, blocking the light, their presence turning the store into a cage. Silas watched Finch's eyes. He saw the cold calculation there, the flicker of cruel amusement. Finch wasn't just collecting a debt. He was enjoying the power, the humiliation of it. He was breaking two people for the price of one. "And what does she say about this arrangement?" Finch asked, though the question was not for her. He looked at Leo. Leo wouldn't meet his gaze. Alara remained silent, her body rigid. Her silence was louder than her brother's pleading. It was a refusal, a denial of their right to bargain over her, but it was a silent protest. And in this world, silence was mistaken for consent. Silas felt something cold and hard clench in his gut. It was the same feeling he got when he saw a coyote corner a lamb, the same sense of a profound and brutal injustice. He had built a life around minding his own business. He had fenced himself in for that very purpose. But the fence felt flimsy now. It felt like a lie. Finch reached out and touched a strand of her hair. She flinched, a small, violent tremor that she instantly suppressed. But Silas saw it. Everyone saw it. Finch's smile was predatory now. He had found the fear he was looking for. "Very well, Leo," he said, turning away from her as if the matter was settled. "Your debt is cleared. She will work at the saloon. I'm sure we can find plenty for her to do." The finality in his voice was like a hammer blow. Leo looked relieved, a pathetic, gut-wrenching flood of it washing over his features. He was free. He turned to leave, not even looking at his sister. He was halfway to the door before a voice, low and rough from disuse, cut through the room. "What's the debt?" Every head turned. Silas hadn't realized he'd spoken until the word was already out, hanging in the thick, dusty air. He stood by the counter, his supplies forgotten at his feet. He was looking at Finch. For the first time in years, he was looking a man straight in the eye. Finch's smile tightened. He looked Silas up and down, taking in the worn clothes, the sun-scorched skin, the quiet stillness that was so different from the woman's. "Silas," he said, a note of surprise in his voice, "I didn't think you came to town for the entertainment. This doesn't concern you." "You heard me," Silas said. His own voice sounded strange to him, like a tool he hadn't used in a long time. "What does he owe?" A flicker of annoyance crossed Finch's face. This was an interruption to his little drama, an unexpected variable. He enjoyed the slow, public degradation. This was a crude shortcut. $150, Finch said, naming a sum that was impossibly high. A figure designed to crush all hope. He expected Silas to flinch, to back down. He was watching for the telltale signs of defeat. He wanted to see another man break. Silas didn't even blink. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a worn leather pouch. It was heavy. It held the savings of 3 good years, the money he kept for a catastrophe, a fire, a drought, the kind of disaster the land dealt out. He had never imagined the disaster would have a human face. He loosened the drawstring and emptied a small pile of coins and worn bills onto the counter. He counted it out deliberately, his calloused fingers sorting the money with practiced care. 100, 120, 140. He was short. He paused, and for a moment, a suffocating silence fell over the store. Finch's smirk returned. Leo, who had stopped by the door, looked pale. Alara had not moved, but Silas could feel her gaze on him now, tentative and questioning. He reached into his pocket again, the one where he kept the money for his supplies, and added it to the pile. The coins Abernathy had just given him back. It brought the total to $145.40. Still not enough. He looked at Finch, his gaze unwavering. "The buckboard and the horse," Silas said. "They're worth more than the difference." There was a long, drawn-out moment of silence. Finch stared at the money, then at Silas, then at the woman. He was a man who understood value, and he was recalculating. The horse and wagon were a tangible asset. A woman was a gamble. She could run. She could get sick. She could be trouble. But the public humiliation of Leo, the demonstration of his own power, was also an asset, and Silas was trying to buy it from him. Finch was weighing one against the other. He looked at Alara, who stood like a statue, her face a mask of careful neutrality. Then he looked at Silas, this ghost from the hills, this silent man who had suddenly found his voice. A slow, genuine smile finally touched Finch's lips. This was, in its own way, even more entertaining. "You want to buy a gambler's debt, Silas? What for? You looking for a wife?" The men by the door snickered. The question was a barb, meant to remind everyone of the wife he'd already lost. Silas didn't react. The past was a closed book. He refused to let men like Finch turn its pages. "I'm buying the debt," he said, his voice flat. "Not the woman. The debt is paid. She's free to go." Finch laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Free? Boy, you really have been out of town too long. There's nowhere for a girl like that to go. She's got no people, no money. Her own brother just sold her. What's she going to do?" He gestured around the dusty street outside. "Starve? Her freedom is worth less than that pile of coins." He was right. Silas knew he was right. The knowledge was a bitter taste in his mouth. He looked at Alara, truly looked at her. He saw the flicker of despair in her eyes before she masked it. She was trapped, not by the debt anymore, but by the world itself. He had paid the money, but he hadn't solved the problem. He had only changed the name of the cage. He thought of his ranch, of the spare room that held nothing but old blankets and the lingering scent of cedar, of the endless, thankless work that filled his days. It wasn't a home, not really. It was a shelter, but it was better than this. "She can come with me," Silas said. The words were out before he could stop them. He hadn't planned to say them. He didn't know where they came from. They seemed to belong to a different man. Finch raised an eyebrow. "Just like that? You pay her brother's debt and take her home? That sounds an awful lot like buying the woman, Silas." "She can work," Silas said, ignoring the jibe. "Earn her keep. When she's earned enough to go wherever she wants, she'll go." He looked at Alara then, speaking to her for the first time. His voice was softer, stripped of the hard edge he'd used with Finch. "The choice is yours." For the first time she moved. She turned her head and looked directly at him. Her eyes were a deep, clear gray, the color of the sky before a storm. They held no illusions, no gratitude, only a profound, searching weariness. She was weighing one unknown against another. A saloon in town under Finch's thumb, or a remote ranch with a silent stranger who had just spent his entire savings on a debt that was not his. She looked at Finch, at his polished smile. She looked at her brother, who was staring at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. Then she looked back at Silas. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That was all. Finch shrugged, his amusement renewed. He swept the money from the counter into his pocket. "As you wish," he said. "Don't come crying to me when she runs off with your silverware." He turned and went back into his office, pulling the curtain closed. The show was over. The men by the door dispersed, melting back onto the boardwalk. Their moment of entertainment concluded. Leo, the brother, scurried out the door without a backward glance. He was gone. Abernathy, who had watched the entire exchange without a word, finally moved. He carefully pushed Silas's abandoned sacks of supplies toward him. "You'll be needing these," he said quietly. Silas nodded, his mind reeling. He had come to town for flour and coffee. He was leaving with a stranger. He gathered the sacks, his movements clumsy now, and turned to Alara. She was still standing in the same spot, her small satchel held tightly in her hands. She looked small and fragile in the vast, empty space of the store. "Come on," he said, his voice rough. He walked out into the blinding sun, not waiting to see if she would follow. He heard her footsteps behind him, light and hesitant, on the wooden boardwalk. He had bought a debt. He had inherited a life. The journey back was silent. The sun climbed to its zenith, beating down on them, and the only sound was the rhythmic creak of the buckboard's wheels and the soft plodding of the horse's hooves in the thick dust. Silas kept his eyes on the road ahead, his hands loose on the reins, his shoulders tight with a tension he didn't know how to release. He had broken every one of his own rules. He had spoken when he should have been silent, acted when he should have been still, and tangled himself in the affairs of another person. Beside him, Alara sat ramrod straight, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She did not speak, did not ask where they were going or what he expected of her. She simply endured the journey, her stillness a fortress around her. He could feel her presence like a physical weight, a complication he hadn't considered beyond the moment of the transaction in the store. He had acted on an impulse, a raw, unthinking reaction to a cruelty he could not stomach. Now came the consequences. The consequences were a silent woman sitting beside him, a woman whose future he had just inadvertently purchased. When they were miles from town, the familiar shapes of his own land beginning to appear in the distance, he finally spoke, his voice cracking slightly from disuse. "There's a spare room," he said, staring straight ahead. "It's small, but it's clean." She didn't answer, but he saw her hands tighten in her lap. He didn't know if it was from fear or relief or something else entirely. He didn't press for an answer. The silence that stretched between them was no longer the comfortable, empty silence he was used to. It was a silence filled with questions, with uncertainty, with the vast, unspoken gulf between two strangers, bound together by a desperate act. The ranch came into view, the small cabin, and the sturdy barn, looking stark and lonely against the immense, indifferent landscape. To Silas, it was a sanctuary. He wondered what it looked like to her. He wondered if it looked like another cage. He showed her the room. It was at the back of the cabin, with a narrow window that looked out over the dry creek bed. It contained a simple cot, a wooden crate for a table, and a single nail on the wall for her things. "The well is out back," he told her, his voice echoing in the small space. "Kitchen's there. I'm usually up before sunrise." He left her then, closing the door quietly behind him, giving her the only thing he knew how to give: space. He went about his evening chores, the familiar routine a welcome anchor in the churning sea of his thoughts. He fed the chickens, milked the lone cow, and checked the horse's shod. His movements were automatic, but his mind was not quiet. He kept seeing her face, the unnerving stillness of it, the guarded intelligence in her gray eyes. He had done a reckless thing, a foolish thing. He had brought a storm into his carefully ordered world. When he returned to the cabin, the sun setting and painting the windows in fiery colors, a smell met him at the door. It was the smell of roasting meat and onions, a smell that hadn't filled his home in years. He stepped inside. Alara was standing by the stove, a burlap sack tied around her waist as an apron. She had found the salt pork and the last of his onions and was turning them in a skillet. A pot of water was boiling for coffee. She didn't look at him as he entered, but her movements became a little stiffer, a little more self-conscious. She had taken his kitchen, his supplies, and was making a meal. It was an offering, a statement. "I am not helpless. I will earn my keep." They ate in silence at the small wooden table. The food was simple, but it was the best he'd eaten in a long time. She had a skill he hadn't expected. When they were done, she gathered the plates and took them to the wash basin. He stayed at the table, watching her. The last light of day faded, and the cabin filled with shadows. "Thank you," he said to her back. She paused for a moment, her hands in the soapy water, and then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the beginning of a new language between them, a language of actions and gestures, of shared work and shared silence. It was a language he understood far better than words. Days turned into weeks. A routine began to form, unspoken and unnegotiated. He would rise in the dark and find the coffee already brewing, the fire in the stove stoked and burning steadily. He would do his work on the ranch, mending fences, clearing brush, tending to the small herd of cattle that was his livelihood. And when he returned at midday, there would be a plate of food on the table. In the afternoons, she found her own work. She claimed the small, struggling vegetable patch behind the cabin, coaxing life from the hard, unforgiving soil. With a patience that astounded him, she mended his clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the needs of the animals, the moods of the weather. She moved through his world with a quiet competence that was its own form of grace. She never spoke of her past, of her brother, or of the day in the mercantile, and he never asked. Her story was her own, and he had no right to it. He had bought her debt, not her history. He watched her, though. He noticed things. He noticed the way she would sometimes pause in her work and stare out at the vast, empty horizon, her expression unreadable. He noticed the way she spoke to the chickens, her voice a low, soft murmur that was gentler than any sound he had ever heard her make for a person. He noticed a long, thin scar on her left forearm, pale against her skin, a relic of some past pain she kept hidden. He began to see the resilience beneath the stillness, the steel beneath the fragile exterior. She was like the desert plants that grew in the cracks of rocks, tough and tenacious and built for survival. She did not complain about the heat, or the dust, or the loneliness. She simply worked, she endured, and in her quiet, persistent presence, the ranch began to change. The silence was no longer empty. It was shared. The cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a home. He would find himself mending a sagging porch step, not just because it was broken, but because he worried she might trip on it. He fixed the latch on her window that had been stuck for years. Small things, unspoken things. He was shoring up the foundations of this new, fragile life they were building. A life neither of them had chosen, but both were now a part of. He would spend a long time afterward wondering when the feeling of responsibility had shifted into something else, something quieter and more profound. He couldn't name it. He didn't try. One afternoon, he came back from the north pasture to find a visitor. A horse was tied to the hitching post, a fine-looking sorrel with a silver inlaid saddle. Silas's hand went instinctively to the axe handle leaning against the cabin wall. Finch was sitting on his porch, in his chair, as if he owned the place. He was smoking a thin cigar, the smoke a foul gray smudge in the clean air. He smiled when he saw Silas approach, that same cold, precise smile. "Silas," he said, his voice casual, "good to see you. I was just admiring your little setup here. It's rustic." Silas stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his hand still on the axe. He didn't speak. He just waited. Finch gestured with his cigar toward the garden, where Alara was on her knees, pulling weeds, her back to them. She's done wonders with the place, Finch said. Got a green thumb, that one. More valuable than I thought. I've come to correct my mistake. Silas's grip tightened on the wood. There's no mistake, he said, his voice a low growl. The debt is paid, Finch chuckled. Oh, the debt is paid, certainly. I'm not a man who goes back on a deal, but I'm a businessman, Silas, and I've come to make a new one. I'll give you $200 for her, a $50 profit for you. You can buy a new horse, a new wagon, and still have your savings back. It's a good deal. He took a puff of his cigar, his eyes glinting. The saloon is doing well. I need a respectable woman to manage the books. Keep the girls in line. She has the look of someone who can command respect. People will pay for that kind of atmosphere. He was talking about her as if she were a piece of furniture, an asset to be acquired and put to use. The casual cruelty of it made Silas's blood run cold. At the sound of their voices, Alara had stopped her work. She rose slowly, brushing the dirt from her hands, and turned to face them. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable, but Silas saw the way she stood, her feet planted firmly, her shoulders back. She was not cowering. She was listening. She was waiting. She's not for sale, Silas said. Each word a stone dropped into a deep well. Finch's smile faded. A flicker of impatience crossed his features. Don't be a fool, Silas. Everything is for sale. Everyone has a price. You, of all people, should know that. You bought her for $150. I'm offering $200. That's good business. He stood up, tossing the cigar into the dust, and took a step toward the edge of the porch, looking down at Silas. His voice dropped, becoming colder, sharper. Or perhaps you don't want to do business. Perhaps you'd prefer, I speak to the sheriff about a man living out here in the wilderness with a woman who isn't his wife. A woman he bought. It wouldn't look good. People in town talk. They'd believe the worst. It was a threat, plain and simple. He was leveraging the town's suspicion, Silas's own reputation as an outcast, against him. He was using the world's judgment as a weapon. Silas felt a surge of white-hot rage, but he held it in check. Violence was what Finch understood, what he expected. It would only prove him right. He had to find another way. He was still trying to form the words, to find a response that wasn't the swing of an axe, when a third voice joined the conversation. It was quiet, but clear and steady as a bell. I am not for sale. Alara had walked over from the garden and was standing at the foot of the porch steps, a few feet away from Silas. She was looking directly at Finch, her gray eyes holding his without a trace of fear. My brother's debt is paid. My own debt here is being worked off. When it is done, I will decide where I go. It will not be with you. Her voice did not tremble. Her hands were steady at her sides. In that moment, she was not the terrified, silent girl from the mercantile. She was a woman laying claim to her own life, to her own soul. She had found her voice in the silence of the ranch, and she was using it now as both a shield and a sword. Finch was momentarily stunned into silence. He had been negotiating with Silas, man to man, over a piece of property. The property had just spoken back. He stared at her, his mind clearly working, recalculating again. He saw not a victim, but an adversary. He saw a will that was as strong or stronger than his own, and he saw that he had lost. The kind of power he wielded, the power of money and intimidation, was useless against the kind of strength she possessed. He couldn't buy it, so he couldn't own it. A slow, ugly flush crept up his neck. He had been dismissed by her. He turned his glare on Silas. You'll regret this, he snarled. It was a petty, empty threat, the last resort of a man who had been defeated. He stomped down the steps, untied his expensive horse with a vicious tug, and mounted. He spurred the animal hard, riding away in a cloud of dust and fury, leaving behind nothing but the lingering, foul smell of his cigar. He was gone. Silas and Alara stood in the silence he left behind. The wind sighed through the mesquite trees. The chickens clucked softly in their pen. The world was as it had been before, but everything was different. Silas looked at her, at the quiet dignity in her posture, the unwavering strength in her eyes. He had thought he was protecting her. He realized, with a sudden, humbling clarity, that they had been protecting each other. He let go of the axe handle. His hand felt empty. Dinner will be late, she said, her voice once again quiet. She turned and walked back to her garden, her movements calm and deliberate, as if she had not just stared down the most powerful man in the county, As if she had not just saved them both, Silas watched her go. A debt had been paid. A life had been claimed. Not by him, by her. Weeks later, the first real rains of the season came, a soft, steady drumming on the tin roof that washed the dust from the air and turned the parched earth dark and fragrant. For 2 days, they were confined to the cabin, the world outside a blur of gray mist. The silence between them was different now, easier. The space between them had been filled not with words, but with a shared understanding, a trust forged in a moment of quiet defiance. He spent the time repairing a broken harness, the smell of leather and wax filling the small room. She sat by the window, reading from one of the 2 books he owned, her brow furrowed in concentration. Sometimes he would look up from his work and find her watching him, a small, thoughtful expression on her face. She would not look away, and a silent acknowledgement would pass between them before he returned to his task. On the 3rd day, the rain stopped and the sun broke through, making the wet world glitter. He went outside, the air clean and cool in his lungs. He walked to the edge of the porch and looked out at his land. It looked new, washed clean, full of promise. He found himself walking to the small shed where he kept his tools and lumber. He spent the rest of the day in a fever of activity. He planed wood, measured, and sawed, the sounds of his work a new kind of music on the quiet ranch. Alara came out and watched him for a time, her arms crossed, a question in her eyes. He did not explain. He just worked. By evening, he was done. He had built a small, sturdy rocking chair and placed it on the porch, next to his own. It was not perfect. The wood was rough in places, the lines not quite even. But it was solid. It was strong. It was meant to last. That night, after dinner, he sat on the porch in his usual spot. After a few moments, the cabin door opened and Alara came out. She hesitated for a second, then walked over to the new chair and slowly sat down. It creaked softly under her weight. They sat there together, rocking in a slow, comfortable rhythm, as the sun went down and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, 1,000 tiny points of light in the vast, quiet dark. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. A home had been built, not of wooden nails, but of small kindnesses and a shared, resilient peace. It was enough. You know, it's a funny thing about value. Some people think it's something you can measure in dollars, or in acres of land, or in the strength of a man's hands. They think it's something you can buy, or sell, or own. But maybe the real value of a person isn't in what they can do for you, or what they cost, but just in the simple fact that they exist. Maybe the greatest strength isn't found in a loud voice or a fast gun, but in the quiet dignity of a soul that refuses to be bought, that insists on its own worth, even when the whole world is telling it it's worthless. We all face moments where we see an injustice, big or small. We see someone being treated as less than they are, and in those moments, we have a choice. We can look away, we can tell ourselves it's none of our business, that it's safer to stay fenced in. Or we can do something. We can offer a hand, or a word, or just our presence, and affirm the value that money can't measure. What do you think? When have you seen someone's true worth shine through? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this story, please consider liking and subscribing. Your support means the world. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening.